to Wake the Bear Radio with your host, Brandon Johnson, Chris Hurst, and Ron Powers. All right. I love hearing that roar every week. Yes, the Bears, California. The Bear is waking up, and we are glad that you can be with us tonight as we do another show. This is show 118, I think. Yeah, 118. So really exciting to get back behind in the studio just after we spent an incredible weekend with the Reawakening Tour. It's Clay Clark's Reawaken America Tour. So it was amazing. Every 15 minutes to a half hour, they had a different speaker. And I left blessed and really energized and encouraged. How about you guys?
Yeah, well, we got a chance to meet Michael Flynn, General Flynn. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, the general himself.
Wake the Bear t-shirts, and this was after the show. What an amazing event. I mean, 70 speakers over the course of 15, over 2 days, 15-minute speeches, just a ton of information, and just really high quality speakers, doctors, lawyers, people who are really well accomplished, who are really well spoken, talking about just waking America back up. And I love the name, Reawaken. My new book's going to be called Re-America. So it's definitely one of the re words. Do it again, Lord. Bring us back to our founding. Change us back. And this whole thing was dedicated to that, of course.
Yeah, there was so much energy at the Reawaken time, and we got a lot of content. I know we all learned something, and we met new friends. We got new ideas. We understood some new things. So if you get a chance next June in Detroit, Michigan, they're going to have their next one. So we'd encourage you to go. Also, we went live in a bear pause from there, and we just put that up on our website at wakethebearradio.com. So check it out, and you can hear us while we were there. I think I'm just now thawing out I can finally feel my toes again. It was cold.
It was cold. Yeah, it was in a big I don't want to call it a warehouse. It's kind of like the Cow Palace, where they probably do agriculture stuff, but they did not have any heaters, and so it took a while to warm up. I was freezing. Yeah,
you kind of see up there. Big old Cow Palace type of thing. We did get a chance to meet Liz Crokin, the vampire hunter, who was featured in the film that we showed at Convergence called Out of Shadows and Into the Light. Both those films were showed. She's in both of those. She's really brought a lot of information out about some of the child trafficking that's been going on in our country and really exposing the darkness, which, of course, that's what this show is about, is exposing darkness, asking questions, not just going along as mindless sheep, believing the narratives that people give us, but actually asking questions. And all of these speakers were doing that. They were challenging us to think deeply, think more clearly about some of these major issues. What were some of the major highlights that you had, Chris or Ron?
Go ahead, Ron.
Okay, for me, it was Doné Clement Petrushka. She is the daughter of the late Kim Clement, who actually was a prophetic voice. And I actually wound up doing a bear pause earlier today. I would really encourage you to take a look at it. It's on Rumble and Cloud Hub. And it basically, I just played it. I just introduced it. It just moved me so much. I was so encouraged. And one particular part that I was really encouraged was that there was a part where Kim, years before, said a man by the name of Mr. Clark will be sitting with Donald, and I am speaking to you. And you're asking, are you speaking to us? Is it us? Yes, it is you. And you will win this election. You will win that election. And the thing is Clay Clark had never met the president during the first election. And so he had just met him in the last year or so in person and sat next to him, and they both watched it. And he says, "You're watching me." And so that to me says that this is the second one And so I was really encouraged by that. So please watch it. If you're not sure about the prophetic, you think it's corny, or you're totally into it, I think it would be the perfect one to watch. It's really a good one. So,
well, yeah, and I think it was really good. I mean, here he is prophesying about Donald Trump being president in 2007, well before he even was a candidate to run. And so he gives a bunch of prophecies, which, are a little freaky when you read them, when you listen to them and you see the time and date stamped on them, that he was getting these downloads from God. And so some of us are new to the prophetic, and I've been in a little bit, but I know that God speaks for people's encouragement and exhortation and comfort, but he also speaks about the what's about to take place. The prophets, the Bible says that God does nothing without first revealing what he's about to do his servants, the prophets. So we saw some major things happen, that were prophesied well before it. So yeah, and I watched some of your Bear Paws, Ron, really good. So check it out on our normal Wake the Bear radio down here. Click on there and go watch this most recent Bear Paws.
Yeah, and I think I enjoyed Judy Mikovits. It's the first time I had heard her in person, and she's a former American research scientist, a brilliant biochemist, and an anti-vaccine activist from the research. She did work with Dr. Fauci, and she had some things to say about that research and about him. And it's a great segue into our guest tonight.
Yes, we have a really, really great guest tonight, and I'm excited to have him. This is Leon Canero. He's coming on here. He wrote a book here. I'm going to share the screen of this book, and the unfortunate truth about vaccines. And this book is exposing the vaccine orthodoxy, Leon Canero. And so we're just about to bring him on. I just want to show his picture before I brought him on, and I'll stop the screen share and bring Leon on. Welcome, Leon.
Well, hi there.
Oh, welcome. We're honored to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on our show finally. I met you at Santa Cruz Brave and Free that one night. Yeah, and I got to meet you at Santa Cruz Brave and Free that one night. I remember people were asking you about your book, and you're like, I'm not here to sell my book. I'm just here to make friends. And we're like, no, tell us your book. And then I got a copy of your book, and man, I'm loving it. It's very well written, very succinct to the point, really well researched. And why don't you maybe tell us just a little bit about your background? What I know is that you are involved in early education, and you were seeing some correlation between vaccines and autism and other neurological disorders. So just tell us a little bit about your background. How'd you get into this? What made you write the book? Where have you kind of been led in your journey?
And what part of the bear do you want to wake up?
I'm getting over a cold, so please bear with me if I start coughing and hacking here. I was a school psychologist for 35 years, from 1972 up until I retired in 2007. And I worked with special needs children at the preschool, elementary through high school, and post-secondary level. And in the early 90s, I noticed all of a sudden this dramatic increase in the number of autistic children. And having worked with them going back more than 20 years previously, I realized that autism was an extremely rare condition, that it was roughly 1 in 10,000 back in 1970. And so when I started seeing all of these autistic children coming up, I started to wonder what was going on, and I looked into it. And one of the things that I noticed was that there was this connection between the increasing amount of vaccines that children were receiving at the same time that there was this dramatic increase in autism. And the more I looked into it, the more it became obvious to me that this was, in fact, a connection. And when I tried to talk with others in the field, other psychologists and people in special ed and even administrators, I was surprised to see that there was such a resistance to the notion that there could be any problems with vaccines. And so that led up to me getting more involved, and I ended up writing a book on the subject. And one of the things that I talk about is the vaccine orthodoxy. And what that means is that there is this belief that vaccines are safe and effective, and the benefits outweigh the risks. And it was hard for me to get that. And so when I looked into, why people were so resistant to it, it seemed that it had a lot to do with the mythology that we've all grown up with, that we learned from early childhood, that vaccines cured polio and smallpox, and that it was the savior for millions of children and people around the world. And it was presented as something that was one of the great miracles of modern medicine. However, I didn't see it quite that way. And I've been trying to understand how we could talk with people in a way that they could put aside their beliefs and be open to the possibility that there's more to this subject than what people realize. And it's hard because you grow up with this notion that vaccines have always been wonderful, and that the medical community reinforces it all the time, and in the media and so forth, that they've saved lives and all of that. And so I made reference to an American historian, Daniel Borstein, and he wrote that the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it's the belief, the perception of knowledge. And this to me is like what is one of the main problems in trying to talk with people about this. Because if people believe strongly that what they believe, for them, it ends up living to them as if it is the truth. And once something is believed to be the truth, you don't question it anymore. What you do is you defend it. And so it's very hard to get people to see that there's perhaps more to the subject. And how do we get people to, be open to taking in more information so that they can, perhaps shift their perspective? And like all topics, as the expression goes, the devil is in the details. And if you don't look at the details, you're most likely just going to kind of go along with what you hear over and over in the media. So one of the things I tried to do in the book, and try to do when I talk with people, is to give kind of a historical perspective about what is the history, to go back and to see where we've started and where we have come to today in regards to vaccines. Back in the 50s, I grew up in the late 40s and 50s. I'm 79. And when I was in elementary school, the first vaccine I ever got was not even a vaccine. It was droplets from the polio vaccine on a sugar cube that everyone in school got. And that was my first introduction with the vaccine. In the 50s, children got maybe 5 vaccine doses. They would get the polio shot, they would get the smallpox, and then the DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. That was it. Those were the only vaccine doses that you got in your entire childhood. By the time the 80s came around, the early 80s, children were then receiving 24 vaccine doses.
Wow.
And there was this dramatic increase where, for example, the DPT shot in the early 80s was given 5 times at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, at 18 months, and then again at 4 years of age. And there was a parent who ended up writing a book, Barbara Lou, um, I'm blanking, Barbara Lou Fisher, who wrote this book, A Shot in the Dark. And what it was an expose of the vaccine, in particular, the pertussis element of the DPT shot that was causing problems. And so you see in the fact that you got 5 DPT shots in the early 80s, that what this was doing was creating problems to such a degree that parents were suing the pharmaceutical industry, and they were winning these multi-million-dollar settlements. And it got to such a point that by the mid 80s, the pharmaceutical industry was starting to say that they wanted some kind of protection from all of these lawsuits. And if they didn't get it, they would stop producing vaccines. So what happened is in 1986, Congress ended up passing the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And what this did is it eliminated any liability for the pharmaceutical industry or medical doctors for any vaccine injuries. And how it was paid for was a 75-cent charge on all vaccines that the government collected to put into a fund to service these children that were damaged by the vaccines.
So, Lee and I had a quick question on that. Do you think the pharmacy or big pharma was doing a bluff, like saying, "Hey, we're going to pull back," knowing that they reached a critical mass that people would say, "Oh no, don't take away the vaccines. We need them." I mean, do you think they were waiting for a certain time, and that way it looks like, "Hey, we're not pushing it, but if you want it, you're going to have to take away the the threat of lawsuits."
Well, I think my take on it is the threat would be for the politicians, because they would not have the money for their own campaigns, because the amount of money that the pharmaceutical industry gives to politicians is enormous, twice as much as the next highest industry. And so I think it was as a way of pressuring Congress to do something. And then Ronald Reagan ended up signing it into law.
Mhm.
Yeah,
that was
one of his mistakes. I thought he was a great president. As Vivek said in the debates, he believed that Ronald Reagan erred in that area.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
But yeah,
there was a conversation with Ronald Reagan and Anthony Fauci where he actually literally said to him, "Well, can't you just make them safer? Like, why do we need to create this special, ability, protections?" And they're like, "No, we can't, because we'll be sued, and we can't do experimentation." So he went ahead and signed it, and man, gosh, it took away all accountability for these.
Yeah, and this has been disastrous. And so today we've gone from 24 vaccines in the early 80s to now it is 72 vaccine doses by the time a child is 18 years old. And this is based on the recommendation of the CDC, their vaccine schedule. And so as a result of this law being passed, what this did is it essentially opened the floodgates. So now the pharmaceutical industry could add any vaccines they wanted, because they knew there was no liability and it was mandated. And so this was like the perfect world for them.
Mm.
So what happened is, starting in the late 80s and going into the 90s, they added the hepatitis B, the Hib vaccine, the DTaP, which is a newer version of the DPT, the Prevnar, the flu shot, the human papillomavirus, the shingles virus. So all of these additional vaccines created increased problems. And so what you see is that as the amount of vaccines increased, the amount of adverse child reactions followed it. There was a direct correlation. The more vaccines, the more autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders.
Wow.
Yeah,
It's
it sounds like
interesting
they're on
about
their
that.
way to go on.
I was
And
going to say
so,
interesting about that. Have you seen the montage of Pfizer supporting all of the news agencies? There's actually a video clip of actually.
oh yeah,
I will show it. I'll show it towards the end, but it's like hundreds of times, probably thousands of times. Brought to you by Pfizer. Brought to you by CNN. Brought to you by Pfizer. ABC. Brought to you like so that so they get a immunization. I mean, there's no accountability. It's mandated, and they can just funnel money to the news medias, which will just tell them continue to keep saying what they want them to say, not questioning any of their of the studies or any of the problems, adverse
yeah,
reactions.
And you said, let me just confirm, you said that that as a lobbyist group, the pharmaceutical companies are twice as much as the next highest lobbyist group for our congressional and members. Is that correct?
yeah, absolutely. There's about 3 times as many lobbyists from the pharmaceutical and health industry than there are congressmen in in Congress. So we're talking about roughly 1,500 lobbyists, and politicians really don't know anything about vaccines. They pretty much go along with what the pharmaceutical industry says, the lobbyists and the medical establishment, which is pushing these vaccines. And so consequently, they go along with it. They think, well, what could be the problem? They don't look into the details. What they realize is that if they go along with these recommendations, they benefit financially, and that's the problem. And so these vaccines just keep on getting added on, and there's little discussion about the problem with these vaccines, because everyone again comes from the point of view that vaccines are safe and effective and they save lives and all of that.
There's a major conflict of interest here going on.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely is.
So,
Yeah, we understand you're not a physician, you're not a medical doctor, but your story is that you observed some things in education with special needs, and you were able to then begin to do that, triggered you to the research, and that you began to see correlations between the increased vaccine schedule and then the amount of neurodeficits and autism in children.
yeah. And if you look at the amount of vaccines that the United States gives compared to all the other countries in the world, we exceed all of them. So we give more vaccines than any other country. And more significantly, we give more vaccines at an earlier age than any other country in the world. And if vaccines were so wonderful, then we would actually assume that we would have the healthiest children on the planet because we give the most vaccines, when in fact we have the worst health outcomes in our children compared to all the other developed countries in the world.
Wow.
And
Wow.
people don't get that. They don't hear it. But that is in fact what's going on.
It seems like you have an awareness. I mean, that you're going about your business in the education department, and you're just looking and noticing, hey, there's an increase in numbers, but enough to drive you to to do some investigation. I think that's a really key point, because I think for our audience, a lot of times our audience is like, well, what can we do to help the cause and stuff? And I think you're a prime example here, that the fact that you weren't a doctor, but you were actually right there at ground zero with the education department with kids in schools, and you're noticing something, and you did something about it. You actually said, I think I'm going to look into that, rather than, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I have a lot of friends that have seen the increase because they know some friends that now have kids with autism, but they don't do anything. And so my hat's off to you for that, that you actually, went forward and did something about it. You said, I'm going to look into this. And I think this is very valuable.
And you said, Leon, you said that when you started, that autism in the 70s was 1 in 10,000. And it's my understanding now that in America, autism is 1 in 36. Is that a correct statistic according to what you understand?
You hear different statistics. I think the latest that I've seen, and that was as of 2020, it was 1 in 30, and this was by a survey done through government that was actually covered in Pediatrics Journal, put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics in June 2022.
So that would be like in a normal classroom. I grew up with, there are usually about 30 kids in a classroom. That would be one of those kids in every single classroom is projected to get autism now. And I also saw a statistic that they were expecting that to rise by 2032 to 1 in 2, which I found that just not only frightening, but difficult to believe. I mean, it just took my breath away. When my children were given their inoculations, it was about, we were told it's about 1 in 10,000, and you go, benefits, risks, 10,000, that's a lot of people, considering what they said the benefits were. And so even though every time my kids had vaccines, I was concerned. I watched them very closely, but it was a risk at 1 in 10,000 that I assumed as a parent I was supposed to take. But 1 in 30, that's incredible.
Yeah, it is. It's shocking because the implications are, I just can't even imagine what the world would be like if half the children in 2032 are autistic. And they're predicting that in males, it'll be 80%. So this would be catastrophic. And if you look at the amount of vaccines that children receive today, by the time they're 6 months old, they will receive 25 vaccine doses following the CDC vaccine schedule. This was unheard of in previous generations. Like back in the 50s, a child would get maybe 5 vaccine doses, and they wouldn't have to do that until they entered public school at maybe 5 years of age. And so what we're doing is we're inundating these immature infants with these vaccines. All of them have toxic ingredients. We give the hepatitis B vaccine to an infant 12 hours after they come out of the womb. Hepatitis B is something that people who are sexually active get, or someone who is a drug addict sharing needles. This is hardly a classification for a newborn coming out of the womb. And so the rationale that the CDC later came up with was the fact that because adults are not getting the hepatitis B vaccine, if we give it to newborns, by the time they become adults, they'll have coverage, which doesn't make sense to begin with. But the fact is that all of these vaccines wane with time. So an infant that gets this vaccine at birth will have no coverage by the time they're an adult. And yet that's the rationale they use. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the Hep B schedule right now is maximum of 10 years. You check your titers, but at 10 years as a healthcare provider, I had Hep B in order to work in the high risk environment that I was in the field, but for little infants. And I could see, I mean, if you have a known, the placental blood barrier carrying, if there were an exception, if the mother were Hep B positive and there might have been a transmission, you can still check the titer level of the newborn to see if there's been a transmission that's occurred. So it does feel just so invasive and so traumatic on a little ones. We don't even circumcise children until they're 8 days old. You know, they need a certain amount of time for that vitamin K cascade system to develop for blood clotting, but to have newborns right out of the womb get some of these before they go home so they can catch them before they go home is just, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and this is done universally across the country, that newborns will get the vitamin, the hepatitis vaccine right after birth. At 2 months, they'll get 8 more vaccine doses. At 4 months, they get 7. And at 6 months, they get 9 more vaccine doses. If you look at, for example, SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, this is deaths that occur in the first year of life. What you see is that the vast majority of these children that develop SIDS, that die in their sleep, that's why they call it crib death, get this, 95% of them develop the SIDS by the time they're 6 months old. The vast majority of them occur between 2 and 4 months of age. Between 2 and 4 months of age, they're receiving 50 vaccine doses following the CDC schedule. So this is a very critical period when the child, by definition, is immature. And this is what is causing such havoc in these children. And it's so clear. You know, there are studies that show that children who get these vaccines during this critical period end up developing a form of apnea, which is the cessation of breathing. That's why they end up dying in the crib while they're sleeping. And this is always after they get a series of vaccinations and they come home. It's not before vaccinations. As they get the vaccination, they come home, and then they're found dead in their crib.
Wow.
It's interesting that that whole back to sleep program for infants was implemented in the early 2000s, where all of a sudden, you know, when my kids when I put them down, they would go often face down, they'd go or lateral in their crib. And then suddenly, because of the sudden increase of infant mortality, they said, oh, the problem is you're putting them to sleep on the stomach. I mean, they've been doing that for years.
I'm glad you brought that
So
up.
now the solution is you need to put your baby to sleep on their back so they don't have these apnea the episodes. And when I was a medic, I started out in the 90s, and I probably went on in my first few years 1 or 2 a year. And I had a large area that I helped service as a paramedic. And as I left the field in my career around 2010, there were much more increases of these episodes of sudden infant death, which they said they couldn't figure out what would cause it. They had all these high risks. So parents were very concerned. And I love that you were able to correlate some of these to the 2 to 4 month time frame.
Yeah. And, you know, this notion that these kids are dying because you're not having them in the right position when they sleep, as if throughout history, children were, just sleeping when one position, and they're just so nonsensical. It just makes no sense at all. And so they will dance around this topic, the CDC and the FDA and medical officials, and they'll never really address what's going on. It's self-preservation. They've gone in so deep into defending vaccines that now they don't know how to get out of it. They don't know how to cop to the truth. And it's frightening, because this is not decreasing. It's continuing to be a problem.
Yeah, it's getting to a point where it can't even be ignored. I mean, if you got down to one out of every two, or even 1 out of 10, I mean, you can cripple a country. I mean, you have a whole
Oh,
generation
yeah.
that you have to take care of 10% or 50% of the population as they get older. That's unsustainable.
Yeah.
Well, and I've also heard RFK talk about this a bit, and he says, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Francis Collins, the NIH, the NIAID, these organizations exist to help make Americans healthier. Like, their whole job is to make, and what have we seen is that we've seen autism increase by 400% since Dr. Fauci began his job in the 80s all the way to today. That's an extreme fail. And we're talking millions and millions of dollars that have been poured in to studies, and all of these, vaccines have just increased. And then you got people paying each other. The politicians getting paid by big pharma getting paid by the government getting paid. It's like this circular system of really systemic evil.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, it's unbelievable how corrupt the system is. And most people don't get that. Most people think, well, if the CDC says something or the FDA says something, that it must be true. But when you actually look into what's going on, you realize that they're essentially co-opted by the money interests, the pharmaceutical industry. And it's frightening.
There are millions of unvaccinated children, and obviously they're more than millions. You have vaccinated children. Do you know of any studies that have been conducted by the government, the FDA, CDC, WHO, or other health industry agencies that has studied the vax versus the unvax as far as health outcomes in children? Have you seen any studies at all?
Not by the government. What they say is, well, it would be unethical to withhold vaccines from children, to make a comparison between those who are vaccinated and unvaccinated, which is nonsense, because there's groups that refuse to be vaccinated. Again, it's just a way of deflecting from the reality.
Right. They've got the groups already in place, don't they? They just have to do a study. Did you read that article about the Amish who don't vaccinate their children, and
they don't have autistic children?
That's right. They didn't.
They're healthy children. Yeah, I mean, the studies show that when you compare vaccinated to unvaccinated, the vaccinated child has a much healthier outcome. There was the film Vax 2, which went around the country, and it interviewed all of these families that had vaccine injuries. And then they also interviewed parents that never vaccinated their child, and the difference between these unvaccinated children and how healthy they were as compared to those who were vaccinated and became autistic or had severe mental disorders and so forth is just it's unbelievable. I want to talk a little bit about autism. So autism in 1970s was 1 in 10, By 1985, after they had increased the amount of vaccines that children were receiving, it went down to 1 in 2,500. So there was a four-fold increase by 85. When you get
That
to
was 1 in 10,000.
10,000.
1 in 10,000,
Not 1 in 10.
and by around 2000, it was 1 in 250, a tenfold increase in vaccines. And then when you look at the last 2020, we're down to 1 in 30. All of that, again, correlates directly to the amount of vaccines that children are receiving today. We already talked about 80% of boys by 2032, and half of the children falling on the autistic spectrum by that time.
Do you understand what the pro-vax argument would be towards the correlation? I think one family member that I spoke to said the reason that there was a discrepancy was they didn't have the data back then. They didn't know what autism was. They hadn't diagnosed it. They didn't know the signs and symptoms. I don't know much about the history of diagnosing autism. Can you address that?
Well, autistic children stand out immediately from normally developing children because of all their behaviors, the hand flapping and head banging and rocking back and forth, and their inability to communicate, isolating themselves from their family all of a sudden, losing the developmental skills that they had learned up to a certain point. For example, 80% of the autistic children are what's called regressive autistics. And this is where children develop normally until they get into like toddlerhood, 15, 18, 2.5. And when all of a sudden they just revert to this lower level of development. And it's always after they have a series of vaccinations. You don't see regressive autism in children who are not vaccinated. It's always after the vaccinations. And so, again, you go to the CDC website and they'll have a heading saying that vaccines do not cause autism. They're lying. There's over 100 studies to show that there's this direct correlation. And when you just look at the statistics over time, you see that, again, there's this obvious correlation between the two. And they'll look at anything except vaccinations. It's like the elephant in the room that they won't acknowledge. And that's what we're dealing with. Mark Twain said a long time ago, we have the best government that money can buy. And what we have today is, people talk about, we should get money out of politics or follow the money. Why do people say these things? Because that's how business is done. The money interests control what goes on for the most part when you deal with big government. And, there's so many examples of fraud by the pharmaceutical industry. And between the year 2000 and 2022, the pharmaceutical industry paid out fines, criminal fines, for over $95 billion. $95 billion is $95 million times 1,000, to give that kind of a perspective.
Wow.
So in those 22 years, they were fined. All of the vaccine industries were fined. Between 2000 and 2018, prior to COVID, the vaccine industry made net profits of $2 trillion. So you see, the 95 billion that they paid out in fines is the cost in order to do business. This is typically what they do. And so these fines, for example, the number one fine was from Johnson and Johnson. They were fined over that period of time $15 billion. They were cited. Uh, they were cited like 72 times. 72 separate fines, criminal fines, for lying to doctors, for distorting the test results, for leaving out negative results, building up the positive results from these tests, prescribing medications for children that were never tested for children. You know, it goes on and on. Merck was number two, and they had what is it? They had 81 criminal fines over that period of time. And then Merck, Pfizer, that was third, they had $10.3 billion in fines. And they were fined on 90 different cases. So this is not.
And you're not talking about those compensations for vaccine injuries. You're talking about illegal criminal activity by pharmaceutical companies regarding the product that they're releasing on the public.
Yeah, they're a criminal organization, and there's no other way of putting it. Anyone who gets fined 90 times, criminal fines 90 times, most people would end up in prison long before. But this is what happens, and they know that they're causing these problems. You know, you look at the opioid crisis. You know, over 500,000 people have died from the opioid crisis, and there's actually an excellent mini series I highly recommend if people can get hold of it. It's called Dope Sick. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's on Hulu, and what it is, it's the story of the Purdue Pharma that put out the vaccine OxyContin, and it describes perfectly how the system works, how government turns a blind eye, paid off essentially, in order to, you know, keep producing this drug that is making people addictive. And instead of acknowledging what the problem is, they talk about it as if it's a pseudo addiction, not a real addiction. And they kept on increasing the dosage because the dosage wasn't working. And so what happened is you had so many people that were becoming addicts and dying from this vaccine. There was the Vioxx, is anti-arthritic drug, and that was responsible for 140,000 heart attacks and 60,000 people who died by the time it was shut down in 2004. And when you look at the records, what you see is in the testing that that Merck did prior to the release of this drug, they knew in their trials that this was creating heart attacks and strokes, and they released it anyway.
Do you think in that TV, when they say side effects may be, it's because they found it in testing? You know, you hear it on TV all the time. These
well, that's a very interesting thing. People have become so desensitized to these commercials. They show people prancing around with not a care in the world while they're talking about the fact that they can die, they can have heart attack, they can go blind. It goes on and on. And people hear that over and over, and after a while, they don't pay attention to it. But this is what is happening.
Yeah, and every one of those there are people underground right now because of the side effects.
Absolutely. And, you know, it seems like when you turn on the TV every night, there's a new drug that they're talking about. It amazes me. I wish, you know, I thought about, you know, just listing all the new drugs that I keep hearing every night. And because the pharmaceutical industry has such a hold on the mass media, you know, roughly 75% of the money that the networks take in is from the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
And the pharmaceutical industry has, you know, people on their boards. And so they indicate what can be allowed to be on TV. And if someone wants to talk about something that goes against the pharmaceutical industry, they can it. So people can't get the actual news. They just get what, you know, the pharmaceutical industry wants to present to them.
And then you get commentators that have anyone questioning the narrative about vaccine called vaccine hesitant. They're labeled as tin hat conspiracy theorists.
Yes, yeah, anti-vaxxers like me. And it's awful. And, you know, the public, for the most part, buys into it. And so it's a real stiff climb, you know, to deal with, you know, what people hear over and over and over again.
In your research, I've got a friend who was a speech pathologist and a speech therapist. She had a career in that, and she noticed quite a bit of increase in developmental problems with children over the years from her beginning. She's now retired, but I asked if she wanted to text in a question. She said, is there a movement afoot to overturn the immunity from liability that Congress gave Big Pharma by not holding them accountable for adverse effects? If so, what can we do to support that movement? Are you familiar with anything like that?
Yeah, it's tough. It is real tough because you're going against a lot of money. You're going against a system that has essentially just, you know, gone along with what Big Pharma wants. You know, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wanted to write a book that gave people a basic understanding of the history, you know, in plain language that they could understand. Because unless we educate the public, nothing's going to happen. If we're waiting for it to happen at the top, we're going to wait a long time because the system is rigged. And you know, the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, the AAP, and you know, on and on. They're all in the pocket of the money interests, and it's hard for people to get that. You know, people listen to Fauci and they call him America's doctor. Yeah, he's America's doctor. He's actually America's pharmaceutical doctor, would be a more apt title, because everything he's done, and you know, Robert F. Kennedy's book on the real Anthony Fauci. I mean, if you read that, you realize how corrupt the system is.
That was a great book.
It is corrupt to the core, and most people just can't get that.
Well, in case our audience hasn't seen the example that Leon's talking about, how you know, our media is bought out and controlled by Big Pharma. I think Brandon, did you have a clip on that at all?
Oh yeah, there's a great clip. There's actually a really good montage of brought to you by Pfizer, and I watched it, and it's like 60 times. ABC brought to you by Pfizer. You know, CNN tonight brought to you by Pfizer, and it goes over and over and over again. And then someone actually created like a montage that included the most recent phenomenon that we've been seeing going on in our culture, with people dropping dead on live television or on playing on sports. So check this one out.
Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer. CBS Health Watch, sponsored by Pfizer. Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer. ABC News Nightline.
Brought to you by Pfizer. Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer. This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by
His countdown to the
That does it. That sums it up.
Yeah.
And you said 75% of
Up to 75%.
advertisements
Yeah.
in networks are pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
CBS Health
Watch-
Watch,
watch this
sponsored
one.
by Pfizer. Anderson Cooper 360.
Oh yeah, this one is. I've seen this one.
ABC News Night.
Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on.
Anyways, it just goes on and on.
Yeah.
That's
man.
I shouldn't
disturbing.
even laugh. It's very
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah, that's very disturbing.
You want to laugh, but you realize how,
Yeah.
we haven't even got into COVID. I mean, COVID is vaccines on steroids, the COVID vaccines. I mean, the amount of deaths that are created from COVID is mind-boggling. And yet again, most people, I deal with relatives who, get their shots and they think everything's wonderful, and I'm a quack because, I won't get vaccinated. But it's an enormous problem. And what we're seeing with the propaganda and the censorship is like we've never seen before. It is really unbelievable. It makes you think that we're really not in a democracy anymore, that what we're really in is a beginning of a totalitarian state. And I hate to say it, but when the truth can't be told, when the only thing that is accepted is what the government narrative, the official government narrative is, then we're in trouble. And this is what's happening.
Yeah, anybody who knows anything about history of governments knows that they consolidate their power and they squash anybody questioning their power. And that's really the problem, is that whoever you're not allowed to criticize is the one in power. Whatever the questions you're not allowed to ask are where the truth is. Cui bono, who's benefiting from this? Where's the money? Follow the money. Those are things that I've never preached a political sermon in my entire life. And 4 years ago, I just started smelling a rat, and I said, I need to preach about this, because this is, as a shepherd of God's people, my job is to protect people from eternal hell, but it's also to protect them from hell on earth. And that's what we're seeing happen with these shots. And with there is a level of corruption in our country that is mind blowing, that people just cannot believe, because they want to believe that people are good, that generally people are good, and they just don't understand that the nature of men and women's hearts, when there is no accountability, is the corruption just keeps going. I mean, that's why we have the axiom, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And absolute power comes when people are not questioned, when organizations don't have immunity from questioning, immunity from illegal action, and they realize, oh, well, we're just going to spend about $2 billion on this in criminal cases, because that's just the cost of doing business. Well, wait, that is sick. That is evil, pure evil.
Yeah, I think part of our waking up the bear that we've seen over this time, the last few years, has been the hardest part has been really waking up to that the CDC and the FDA, who are there to protect us, don't often have our best interests, because they are driven by finances, by you follow the money, like Brandon said. And I'm wondering, just for those parents who might be listening tonight and grandparents, Leon, are you familiar with any exceptions or opt-out programs to childhood schedules for vaccine if children are still in public schools?
That's really tough. It's almost virtually impossible in California. Going back when this first came about, we were helping raise our grandson, And I was able to get a doctor up in Santa Rosa signed an exemption, and we just kind of made it through. But today, it's almost virtually impossible, and medical doctors won't do it because of they're putting their neck out. They can actually lose their license if they actually, come up with an exemption for a family, even when there's a legitimate reason.
Yeah.
It's frightening, and so the best I could say is that what families want to do is they want to find a doctor who's involved in functional medicine. It has a larger perspective, not someone who is in the traditional medical model,
Mhm.
who just goes by, the CDC recommendations, vaccinate the kids on schedule. You want to find someone who is sensitive to the dangers of vaccines, and you want to stretch it out as much as possible. Wait as long as you can to an older age. I would never vaccinate a child before 2 years of age. And if it's possible, and I don't know if that's true in this state, if you can break up these multiple vaccinations like the DTaP and the MMR, but I'm not sure you can even do that. But you again, if they have to get vaccinated, you want to spread it out, give enough time, and wait as late as you can in age, because the younger you give these vaccines, the more tendency there is for them to have an adverse reaction. They say that it takes 2 years for the myelin sheath to protect the nerve cells. The myelin sheath is like it would be analogous to the plastic wiring, the plastic covering around wiring as insulation. And so that doesn't totally form until the child is 2 years old. So when you're giving an infant 25 vaccines by the time they're 6 months old, what you're doing is you're creating havoc. And
Can you just not get them? Like you walk out of the hospital, say, "Hey, we're not taking them," and then by the time they're in kindergarten, if you're being forced into a government school, if you waited at least till they were 5. I mean, is that a plan?
yeah, when your child's being born, you can opt out, but you got to be careful. They may go ahead and vaccinate them anyway.
Right.
No, but you really have to be forceful. You have to say, I don't want the hepatitis B and I don't want the vitamin K shot. There's all kinds of problems with vitamin K. And the whole idea was that it's, to prevent children from bleeding and so forth. But this is an extremely rare condition. And the blanket use of the vitamin K doesn't make a lot of sense for most kids.
Yeah, parents absolutely can opt out. They could say, no, we're not going to take vaccinations at this time for our children. Hospitals do not have authority over your bodies or over your children's bodies, but I would never leave my baby with medical staff without following that child with every procedure. So if they're swooshing them away, you want to say, no, we are keeping the child here, or we are following the child, because
I've heard of cases where the parent says, no, I don't want it, and they go ahead and do it anyway when they take the child off from the parent.
Right.
So you got to be very careful.
Yeah, and I have heard too, you may have seen some research on this, that at this time, doctors, pediatricians are actually incentivized to keep children on the vaccine schedules. They get quite a bit of money from the government in order to, if they can prove that a certain number of their patients have kept up with the full vaccine schedule. Have you seen any research about that?
Yes, I have. I talk about it in the book. Blue Shield and Blue Cross will give doctors $400 for every child that's fully up to date on their vaccinations by the time they're 2 years old. And so this is a real incentive. You know, if a doctor has 100, uh, you know, children that are vaccinated by that point, they can make $40,000, and it can go up from there. So it is. There's a lot of incentive. You know, pediatricians, the big bulk of the money they make in their practice is from vaccinations. Not only the kickbacks from like insurance company, but just the, you know, the cost of the vaccinations and visits and so forth. And so it's really tough. And you have, again, you have to, you know, you have to look at who you're going to have as your pediatrician if you're raising a young child. You want to get someone who's sympathetic and can help you kind of, you know, navigate through all of what goes on and what's expected.
Yeah, there's a big movement. It's been going on for a while now, but public school exit, there's a big movement. Hey, don't have the, it's really not public school, government schools. Public doesn't even get any say. The governments are paying off, both the state and of California and the federal government are paying people in the education area to teach stuff that they want taught. And the parents don't even have a say on it. So there's a big movement to get kids out of public or government schools and to get, you know, sometimes it's better. I mean, even if you fail that as a parent, as a teacher, as a parent, it'd be better than putting them into public schools if you're killing them or if you're indoctrinating their brains with a bunch of garbage. So, you know, I think there's, you know, both a movement going on in education, but also to save them from these vaccine schedules that they're demanding they have. Even Christian schools, you know, Christian school down south where the nurse is like, we don't want to have to make you guys do this, but the state of California is pressuring us to do it. And they won't let kids be in school unless they have these vaccines schedule complete. And they won't accept the exceptions even.
Yeah, it's awful. And it's not just the public schools, it's private schools that all of these kids have to be vaccinated. And the only option you have is either leave the state or homeschool, you know, which is not an option for most parents. And it's really tough. It's, you know, stuck between the rock and a hard place. And I just have a lot of sympathy for, you know, what parents are having to deal with.
I have just one more question. I was reading an article, and it said that not a single vaccine on the childhood schedule has been properly safety tested.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I just find that incredible.
Yeah. They call it a biologic. And because it's under the classification of a biologic, they don't have to go through the standard testing that you would with a drug. And that was, you know, as a way to kind of bypass that whole process. And what it ends up, you know, it ends up allowing these vaccines to go on the market with literally no testing. You know, for example, the polio shot was approved after 2 hours. And there were people at that time, doctors at that time, who protested it, but it went through anyway. And when the vaccine came out, it created a scandal. It was called the Cutter incident, in which something like 40,000 children ended up getting polio, and a good number of them died. And it was because they were putting out this vaccine without really understanding what it was. And that's what happens all the time. You know, it's like if you look in my book, I touch on this. If you look at the process for developing these vaccines, it's frightening. It's absolutely frightening. It's total experimentation on infants with no proof of its validity. It's all about money. And you have these panels on the CDC and the FDA, and they just rubber stamp these new vaccines when they come. And it's all people who are on the inside and profiting from, again, passing on the next vaccine.
Yeah, they leave the FDA and they go on some board of directors for a pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have this, revolving door between government and private industry.
Right.
Like what's her name? Anyway, a gal who was in charge of the CDC. She was the CDC director for something like 7 or 8 years. And when she left the CDC, she became in charge of the vaccine division of Merck, where she then went on to make, much bigger salary. And she ended up selling half of her stocks back in, I don't know, a few years ago. And she took home over $9 million selling half of her stocks, in addition to, an incredible salary that she could never make, in government. And that's how business is done. Something like 60% of people who were in government end up in private industry.
Yeah, we want to see that change.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think you made a really good case. I think your book makes a really good case. I think you get into more of the details and the weeds of it. But really what we're trying to do right now is change hearts and minds. We have to change hearts and minds out there. We have to get educate people, get them to ask the right questions, get them to stop just believing that one of the things that we have to do to get to truth sometimes is push well past orthodoxy. And that's the only way we're going to actually get to truth. And so, we have to wake people up one person at a time. Hopefully people that will see the show, people that'll read your book, Leon, if you had like only 5 minutes with somebody and you had a chance to, give them an argument that would get them to question their beliefs about vaccines, what would you do? You say, I got 5 minutes with a person, and how would you address that, or how should we address that with people around us?
Well, I would start off by asking them how many vaccines did they receive by the time they were 6 months old. See what they say, and then tell them. And this is what I've done with people, and they're really shocked. I tell them that infants, by the time they're 6 months old, receive 25 vaccines, and that's a way of kind of shifting their thinking about it. There's so many things that just the basic information about the fact that back in the 50s, children received 5 vaccine doses. Today they receive 72. More than 14 times the number of vaccines they received back in the 50s. And in the 50s, we had very healthy children. You didn't have children that were autistic. You didn't have children that had a peanut allergy. You didn't see children that had autoimmune diseases or cancer. That today, the second leading cause of death in children between 1 and 14 years of age is cancer, only after accidents. And that's not my statistic. That's what the American Cancer Society says.
Wow.
Second leading cause. And what do they get? They get formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is carcinogenic. And formaldehyde is in many of these early vaccines that children receive. And you're giving them to children that are, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months of age. You're dealing with this immature body that hasn't yet developed the ability to fend off what's going on. One of the things that saves them is nursing from mothers. And if you don't nurse your child, that even puts you at a higher level of difficulty in coping with what's going on. So many aspects to this. The whole idea of the vaccines is that it's going to prevent you getting these common childhood diseases like measles, mumps, and chickenpox. But when you look at the research, what you see is that children, like back in the 50s, who get measles, mumps, and chickenpox actually are strengthened. Their immune system becomes stronger. And I could remember back in the 50s what parents would do if a child had chickenpox. They get all the kids in the neighborhood to hang out with them so they would get chickenpox, because parents knew back then if they got chickenpox, they would then have lifelong immunity. And, they would suffer for a couple of weeks or what. And now, if you talk about, child getting chickenpox or measles or mumps, it's like, my God, it's like the plague. They make such a big thing about it. When in fact, getting these natural childhood diseases is what actually prevents them from getting sick later on, strengthening their immune system. It's so ass backwards.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah, and I heard natural immunity is 7 times stronger than the synthetic or the vaccination immunities.
Yeah, well, with vaccines, what you have essentially is lifelong immunity. What you have with the vaccine is temporary immunity. This is one of the problems, for example, the mumps vaccine. Everybody got the mumps vaccine, and even college students had the mumps vaccine, and then they go to college and they get mumps because the mumps vaccine wanes with time. And so they don't have the protection. If they had mumps as an infant, they would have this lifelong protection. And so that's why you're seeing these breakouts of these diseases like measles and mumps and chickenpox in populations that are fully vaccinated. Before chickenpox came around in 1995, children didn't get shingles. And now we're seeing shingles in young children because the chickenpox vaccine, similar to shingles, herpes, gives them shingles. And that was a disease that old people got. And now it's in children.
Interesting.
Wow, this is interesting. So we're getting close to the end of our hour here. I just wanted to thank you, Leon, for just being on the show today, helping us to wake up. There's actually a passage in scripture that actually talks about that the great men of the earth, through their pharmakia, deceived all the nations of the world. And I believe we actually are seeing some of that happen right now, being fulfilled. And so we need to stand up, we need to speak out, we need to proclaim truth, because truth does not need to be defended. It just needs to be let out of the cage like a lion, right? So that's what we're about here on Wake